Right, and welcome to you all this evening for this launch of Ilse Pedler's terrific new book, Auscultation. Here it is, gorgeous new book. The order of the evening will be as such. I'll give a brief introduction. Ilse will read for about 15 minutes. We'll have a couple of questions. If you have a really succinct question in the chat, go ahead and put it in there and we'll take a look at that and we'll get around to that. And then there'll be another brief period of reading at the end. So this will be a relatively quick and entertaining lunch. Right. Ilse Pedler was born in Derby in 1963 and grew up in Birmingham. She has a degree in applied zoology from Bangor University in North Wales and a degree in veterinary medicine from Cambridge, and also is an MRCVS, a member of the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. She's recently moved from Essex to the Lake District, where she runs her own practice specializing in contemporary therapies, complementary therapies. She tries to write for a couple of hours each day, but is often frustrated by calls about sick animals. She's been longlisted in the National Poetry Competition, the Rialto Nature Prize, and highly commended in the Hippocrates Prize. Her poems have been published in Stand, Magma, Poetry News, among others, as well as in several anthologies. She recently won second prize in the Fairs Poetry Competition. The title, Auscultation, means listening to sounds that come from the body. There are also a batch of terrific poems in her book about being a step-parent, full of feeling and empathy. Ilse's poetry collection, the pamphlet, The Dogs That Chase Bicycle Wheels, I have that one too, won the Dyslexia Poetry Prize. And this is how she first came to my attention. Her poems are like terrific. There's a succinct subject matter and a new subject matter, really about animals and people. Right, I will give a little quote now from Kim Moore, who I think is out there this evening. Hello, Kim. Kim says, "This is a unique and utterly original collection. Ilse Pedler explores the brutal and the beautiful world of being a vet and a stepmother. This book is filled with blood, but also with air and light. A book of hard-won knowledge, a book that is both pragmatic and tender, about listening and being listened to, and the types of care we give and receive." So thank you, Kim, for that quote, and welcome, Ilse, and let's hear some of your wonderful poems.
Thank you, Amy. It's fantastic to actually have the physical book in my hand after so many years of writing, and thank you to you and Sarah and everybody at Sarah is just absolutely fantastic. So the book is called Auscultation, as Amy said, and there was a bit of discussion about the title. And to me as a vet, it's a word I use multiple times every day and just part of my language. But there was some worry that it might be a bit too obscure. But when the poems came together in a group, the theme of listening or being listened to came forward so strongly, it couldn't be ignored. So the first poem is actually the first poem in the book, and it's really central to that theme. It's about the consulting room, and it's a privileged place, the consulting room. All of life is there. I've treated animals belonging to rock stars, lords and ladies, the homeless, the violent, the recently bereaved, and I've listened to all of their stories. And this poem reflects that. Visit to the vets. I'm listening when I say, "How are you today?" I'm listening when I tilt my head just so. I'm listening when I say hello to Fluffy, Sooty or Rex. I'm listening when Rex pees up the door. I'm listening when you get a text and text back. I'm listening when you let your kids climb on the table. I'm listening when you answer your phone and say, "I'm in the vets, I can't talk." I'm listening when you carry on talking. I'm listening when you say, "I can't put my finger on what's wrong." I'm listening when you say, "But I know he's just not right." I'm listening when you say you've looked it up on the internet. I'm listening when you say, "Are you sure?" I'm listening when you ask me to predict the future. I'm listening when he growls and you say, "Don't worry, he won't bite you." I'm listening when he tries to bite me. I'm listening when you ask me what's wrong and I've already told you. I'm listening when you start telling me about your other dog. I'm listening when I've heard the same thing 5 times already. I'm listening when I plug my ears with the stethoscope. I'm listening when you say, your job must be so interesting. I'm listening when you say, you vets are all rip-off merchants. I'm listening when you snap at your partner. I'm listening when your kids go quiet and hold hands. I'm listening to the sound of your self-importance filling the room. I'm listening as your opinions start polishing their firearms. I'm listening to the emptiness of your wallet in the silence. I'm listening as your dead husband stands behind you, putting his overcoat around your shoulders. So being a vet has been just the best job in the world and the worst at times. I wouldn't have swapped it for anything, to be honest, and every day is different and every day I learn something new. One of the best things about being a vet is assisting new life into the world and seeing puppies and kittens being born. But when it's an animal like a cow or a horse, the birth is just awe-inspiring. And this next poem is about that experience. It mentions a carving jack, which is a carving machine where you put ropes around the calf and attach it to hooks on this machine, and it's like a ratchet thing, so gives you extra pulling power. So that's what that means. So this is called the carving. Straw hastily spread crisps under the frost's force. A single dusty bulb explores the darkness. She stamps a warning, twists her tethered head, the whites of her eyes moons of fear. The cowman and his lad stamp their numbing toes, thick square hands freezing on the halter's buckle. I prepare ropes and a jack, roll up my sleeves, take off my watch and ring, push them deep into my pocket. I trail cold gel up my arm like the track of a snail, put my fingers together to ease the passage and slip inside. Following the wall of the womb, I touch nose and ear, inch loops of rope over knuckles of hooves, twist the ends over the hooks on the jack and start to pull. She bellows her pain, crushes my bones on hers. We both strain to birth this new life, and only she and I are warm, and I am at the warmth's core. The flip side, of course, is dealing with death and also having to take life. And the next couple of poems are about that. And this one's called Roadblock. The night is a vast blank letter waiting to be written. And suddenly here are the words. Blue and red interrupting the darkness, glancing off shocked faces. High-vis jackets, shoulders hunched against bad news, stationary cars. I lower my window, say I am the vet, and am waved on through. In the road, a horse, spotlit, head down, resting a leg as though tired from a ride. No blood, just trembling under my hands, steam beading the fine hairs on its flared nostrils. And that leg. It is like a child's drawing, bones angled all the wrong way. I don't have what I need and am taken to the surgery, speed elongating the streetlights, then back past journeys put on hold, through the roadblock to the horse. That I can still feel through the rigid cold of the gun. The title poem of the collection, Auscultation, is an exploration of the sound a heart makes. And vets do a lot of listening to hearts. We tune into the normal rhythm, the hesitations, the murmurs. And one thing that made a huge impression on me as a young vet was the sound of a heart stopping. We're so used to the 2-time rhythm, aren't we? The lub-dub, lub-dub. But what I didn't realise was then when something dies, the heart doesn't just stop. It often goes through an erratic series of beats that gradually fade at the end. And this poem is an exploration of that. Auscultation. Tick-tock, non-stop, footstep, raindrop, rooftop, drumbeat, bird's feet, moth wing, stretched skin, tattoo, tail wag, wooden floor, closing door, lip smacking, slapping shut, but softly, distantly. Repeat, rock drip, slip slop, choppiness, undercurrent, groins break water, corpuscles spurt and froth against the jut and not quite stop of slosh and swell and wash and eddy and murmur it, whisper it, butterfly, 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 but. So here's another poem that develops this theme of the sounds that bodies make and the silence. And it came out of just after my father died, and my mother and I went to the funeral parlour to choose a coffin, and the poem came out of that experience. And it's called "The Silence Is." The silence is never silent. Our bodies are never silent. Listen. Can you hear the heart's relentless throbbing, muscling blood through valves, gulping like fish mouths on the surface of the water? Today, the silence is waiting. Here in this funeral parlour, with its rose-scented air fresheners that are making me feel sick, but I can't go outside. I must sit still and silent next to my mother, who is still and silent enough for both of us, as we listen to our blood inching uphill back to our hearts, one pulse at a time. Then in the undertaker's office, where the silence is lost for words at the size of him, the rolls of jowls that wobble as he talks about high gloss finishes and solid brass handles. And all I can think of is, who will carry him? I ask, what about cardboard? The silence is awkward. He sucks in air through flared nostrils. It whistles around scrolled passageways, hisses out with the words, most people want the best for their loved ones. And I should have got up then and taken my mother by the arm and walked away. But he reaches under his desk and pulls out an urn, and as he's talking, he's twisting the top and it comes apart with a sucking whop. The silence is shocked. Our breath softens to a whisper in the sponge of our lungs, and my mother lets out a little muffled sob like a dog being kicked. The silence is embarrassed. Then it gets angry, and I stand up and we need to get out right now. But we know that somewhere cold, the reason we're here is lying, waiting. And the stethoscopes ruled that his silence is final, and all that noise had to stop. So when I was choosing poems for the reading, I realised that there were rather a lot of poems dealing with difficult themes and death. And both my son and stepson are folk musicians, and it's a bit of a standing joke in the folk world that there are no happy folk songs. They're all a bit dismal about broken hearts and doomed lovers being lost at sea. But But what you can do is put the words to a jaunty tune. But I can't do that. But what I can do is I can give you a couple of poems about Morris dancing. And I know that there are a few Morris dancing friends in the audience. I've been a Morris dancer for a long time. I've reached an age where I'm not ashamed to admit it now. And so I've written a fair few poems about Morris dancing, and here's just a couple of short ones. But joking aside, I think the need to dance, that sort of primal urge to gather and to dance is such a deep one, whether it's ballet or hip hop or Cayley dancing. I think there's something so primitive about it. And I hope in this first one that I've tried to maybe sort of explain or capture that a little bit. And it's just called The Morris. The pagan thing is just for the punters. In truth, it's a magpie's trove trawled from wars and trade and music hall. An excuse to shout outside pubs, a peacock strut of baldricks and ribbons, bells, bellies and dented tankards, and that's just the women. It's an excuse to sing ballads, bawdy and sad, to join in choruses about lost love and maidenhead. It is a chance to caper foolishly, to feel the pulse in the music, to stretch muscle against cord. It is catching your partner's eye in the stillness of the half turn before the hay. It is the tuning fork in the bone. It is the need to gather and to dance. And with all pastimes and societies, a bit of politics creeps in occasionally, and Morris is no exception. And the age-old debate in Morris dancing is, should women dance the Morris as well as men? And of course they should. There's lots of references going back to medieval times about women dancing the Morris. And I think it was in the early 1900s it became a bit more of a male-dominated thing. And we should, the next poem is just maybe making fun of that a little bit. And I should mention that we have Morris dancing some of the dances today because Cecil Sharp, the folk historian, cycled around the Cotswolds and wrote the dance moves down and the tunes. And he also shared them with Mary Neal, who was a leading light in the Esperance Society. And she taught the Esperance girls to dance as well. So we should thank her too. So, and there's a lot of debate about, tradition and so on. So this last poem before the short break is called The Living Tradition. Each village had its own tradition, and the traditions were named after the village. Bampton comes from Oxfordshire, and so does Fieldtown, but that village is actually called Leafield. Cecil Sharp's bicycle did all the legwork. He just sat in pubs and wrote it all down. Some pubs he didn't get to, and those villages don't have traditions. Old Tom was out the night Cecil visited, and his son John couldn't remember all of the dance, but Cecil wrote it down anyway. We call that the living tradition. Some traditions come from as far back as 1972. These are the most traditional traditions. You can never tell when a new tradition may appear. Some are spontaneous. The tradition of wearing bells and ribbons dates back to the first recorded sightings of dancers. The tradition of debating the colour of the ribbons is unrecorded, but thought to predate this. The tradition of women dancing the Morris is a sort of source of some disquiet amongst a minority of male sides. However, men dressing up as women is traditional and universally accepted. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ilse. Ilse Pedler and her book, Auscultation. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ilse. It really occurs to me when Ilse is reading, like, what a beautiful combination of the sort of scientific and precise and the emotive her work is. And when we were speaking a little bit beforehand, we spoke of some questions we might ask Ilse. And if you have anything else you would like to ask her in the chat, do it right now and we'll pick that up. But the first question I have for Ilse is about new poems and if there's a new direction she's going in, because there are all these wonderful poems about being a vet. And Ilse then mentioned, well, we'll let her mention what she spoke of then.
Yeah, I think I'll always write poems about being a vet and poems about animals because they've been central to my life for 30 years. But I've been more recently been writing some poems recently about bodies in general, what bodies are, what they mean, bodies of animals, bodies of people, the significance bodies have, the space they take up. So I think I've got a series of poems already coming about those. And I've recently semi-retired and moved up to the Lake District in the last year. And I just run a very part-time practice specialising in complementary therapies, so acupuncture and homeopathy and herbs these days. And what interests me is in a holistic consultation, the questions that you ask delve really deeply into the relationship between an animal and its owner or guardian. And that relationship between animals and people is, I think, one that I feel a series of poems brewing, and I think hopefully they'll come out at some point. So yeah, so bodies and relationships, I think, are going to be the way forward for me.
Excellent. Sounds very interesting. And do you find yourself inspired by the Lake District now?
I do, yeah, and I absolutely love walking on the fells, and it's just such an inspiring place to be, both the landscape but also the history, Wordsworth and the Lakeland poets. And there's been some beautiful poetry written about the Lake District, but there's also a very thriving Lake District scene now. There's a lot of brilliant poets up here. There's Polly Atkin, there's Kim Moore, and many other poems around. And there's the Dove Cottage poets that meet at Wordsworth's house and regularly. And so, yes, it feels like it's a creative place to be, and also the landscape is so inspiring. So yes, there have been a few fell and tarn poems coming out as well.
So you can join that great tradition. I think Katie Hale is here. Hello, Katie. She's from that area. And also Polly Atkin. And we've got a few Sarin people from up that region now. Kim Moore, of course. And Graham Mort, who teaches at Lancaster. And Owen Walls, who's taught at Lancaster. And
have we lost Amy?
Oh, I think so, yeah.
She may come back in a moment. Sometimes her internet does this. Does anyone have a question for Ilse? If do you want to put it in the chat, or anyone want to say anything?
Could I just ask Ilse? Have you always been able to write about animals with that ease with which you obviously, I'm not saying the poems come to you easily, but it's something that you seem to be familiar with in the manner of writing about it? I ask because I was a nurse for many, many years, and I worked in terminal care, and I have never once been able to write a single poem about nursing or any aspect of it, really. And I just wondered how that came about. Was it something that you've always been able to do?
I think so. I mean, and that's not belittling the difficulty of writing poems, but I think when I first started writing, I had almost a bit of a chip on my shoulder almost about not having a background in literature and art and English language and having to do a science degree, because a science degree is just all encompassing. As you know, if you trained as a nurse, there's not a lot of time for anything else. So I almost felt at a bit of a disadvantage. But then I was at a poetry workshop, and somebody said, "Oh, isn't it wonderful you've got another language to use?" And that kind of took me aback. But I thought about it and thought, yeah, I've got all this scientific language that kind of vets and doctors and nurses use every day, don't they? And like auscultation and, these medical phrases. And I felt that it was just another language to me that I could just integrate. So I suppose it came naturally, really, to try and do that. And I think because I'm was dealing with animals every day, I think it takes up a lot of your time, and therefore that's your experience, and that's what you write about. So yeah, I've always kind of interspersed the sort of medical terminology and language in very precise. I suppose being a vet, you're quite precise, so you like to use the correct words and terminology. Yeah.
Thanks, Ilse.
Thank you very much for that question. Ilse, do you want to read, start on the next section of poems, and hopefully Amy will be able to rejoin us at some point.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. So the second half of the book is really about my experiences as a child, and then a mother and a stepmother. And I had quite a strict upbringing. My parents had Victorian values, where they were from that era, and so it was quite a strict childhood. But to be honest, I don't think I was the easiest of children either. But so it wasn't always a happy childhood. But I knew I was loved. So this one is a bit about the sort of background to my childhood, and it's called Unmade. I come from a place where children were seen and not heard, where mantelpiece clocks chimed the quarter hours and lavender bags hung like seed pods in wardrobes. I come from a place where vegetables were dug up from the garden and left by the back door for tea, where trouser pockets were treasure troves of string and polo mints, and a nice piece of brown bread and butter was a show of affection. I come from a place of antimacassars. I come from a place of coral lipstick, where diet sheets were stuck on fridge doors and eyebrows were drawn on with a pencil each morning. I come from a place where perfumes were sprayed on like shellac, where firm control body shapers dried like shriveled cocoons on the line, and hostess trolleys held court in lounges. I come from a place of quiet men. I come from a place where people were as common as muck, where the dining room table was polished to a mirror shine, but we ate our meals from trays on our knees in silence. I come from a place where I was always too young to have an opinion, where one parent would sleep on the sofa for days and shattered glass would be swept up quietly with a dustpan and brush. I come from a place where I tried to be noticed by becoming less, where eventually there was so little of me, I slipped out through the crack between the door and the frame, and nobody noticed I was gone. So one of the greatest joys is motherhood or stepmotherhood, and just rejoice in that energy that having children brings to your life and how they shine a light on your life. And one thing that has always struck me is how time changes when you have a child. Your life sort of becomes measured by theirs. And how can they suddenly be 18 when you still think in your head you're only about 25 yourself? So this next poem is about that, and it didn't quite make it into the book, but it is one of my favourites. And I wrote it on the day that my son took his last A-level exam, and he was looking forward to a holiday away with his mates. And it seemed to me that he had his whole life opening out ahead of him. So this one's called Waiting for Summer to Start. You were coughed out of the exam hall, suspended with your mates like droplets in a breath, quivering with Brownian motion, vibrating around each other until collisions sent you off in 2s and 3s on wobbling trajectories, shushed by teachers shouldering their responsibilities, and you shrugging yours off, leaving for the last time. But you don't look back, because when you're 18, what are last times? Like an actor in a single shot street scene, it's all down on film. Your walk into town, the precise colour of clouds, the lightness of your feet on tarmac, how suddenly the air seems easier to breathe, while outside the pound shop, there's still a queue of people with nothing to do but wait for the bus and check on their phones that the world's still there. And scales peel off the trunks of London planes like scabs. The girl in the chip shop is waiting for summer to start, but you can feel the sand gritty between your toes, hear the shouts of your mates as you kick the ball, see the girls roll their eyes when you take off your shirt, taste the Jaeger bombs and the late night vodka, and watch the sea stretch out blackly forever. And time looks like one of your granddad's old maps, folding and unfolding until the top hangs over the edge of the table, just out of sight. And the last section in the book is about being a stepmother. And stepmothers get a difficult press, don't they? And children are brought up on fairy stories with the evil stepmothers. And I remember when my stepson was little and we were reading one of these stories, and he turned to me and said, "But Ilse, you're not a step monster," which was really lovely. So a stepmother is the love that you have for your stepchild is a little different from the love you have for your own child. And for me, anyway, I can only speak from my own experience. The love isn't any less, but it's just slightly different. And maybe other step parents have their, don't feel that. And this was the poem is trying to sort of make sense of that. It's called Fairy Tales and Step Monsters. I wish I'd held your hand more often. It would have been easy. I wish I'd worried less and made a nest of my fingers for it to curl inside. It used to slip into mine anyway. Do you remember the models we made out of cardboard and paper? Rockets, market stalls, and castles from toilet rolls, me holding things together until the glue dried. Did you ever look in a mirror and long for 3 wishes? However hard I tried, I could only see you through a window, hear your voice on the other side of a door, touch your arm through your sleeve. So unfortunately, as is often the case, relationships between separated parents became difficult, and we ended up going to court to get regular contact with my stepson. And it was a heartbreaking time, and we didn't see him regularly for many months. And obviously these poems are very personal to me and my particular view of the situation, and my stepson's mother would have her story and he has his. But the following poems are about that situation. And I tried, in all of the poems in this final section, I tried to weave the fairy tale theme throughout the poems. And so this one's called A Year in the Forest. Where were you that year? Lost from us in the forest, among giant oaks trousered with ivy and dark pines that cast their needles on the ground. We went in after you, found clearings where you'd been playing, where you'd left piles of stones and stick figures. Once we thought we glimpsed your red coat through the trees. We searched for you on paths that twisted and narrowed, became choked with brambles that snatched at our feet, while the king looked down from his castle and watched it all. What could we do but every week send you letters, tiny white pebbles that shone in the moonlight to lead you back to us? And I should say that in these poems, the king is the judge, the court judge. So this one is The Court Decides. It wasn't 13 fairies that sealed your fate, but a man in black robes, a king in his own little castle. And because those closest to you turned on a spit of loss and hurt and jealousy. Spite was the spindle that made you sleep, and the king, so bored by his own omnipotence, looked over our heads when he gave the verdict that closed you behind a screen of thorns. We waited our 100 years, seeing a blonde-haired boy in every crowd, turning whenever a small voice called out, "Daddy," and tracing the scars of separation with hesitant fingers when we undressed at night. At the appointed hour, we waited by the castle gates, wondering if your sleep had contained our dreams. When the briars parted, we ran to you, woke you with a kiss, and held you as though you were glass. And this final poem, thank you all very much for coming along to the launch and listening. It's great to see so many friendly faces and poets and Morris dancers and friends. It's wonderful, thank you. And thanks once again to Seren. So this last poem isn't in the book, it's in the pamphlet, The Dogs That Chase Bicycle Wheels. And I'm reading it because it's my husband's favourite poem. And there's a story behind it. So as vets, we are often called upon to deal with wildlife. And one morning I got an early call to go and rescue a deer that was trapped in a goalpost net. And realising that it might be a job for two, I asked my husband if he'd come with me. And he said yes, went off and got some stuff. And then we got in the car and drove out. We got to the house, and sure enough, in the garden was this deer caught by its antlers, wrapped up in this goalpost net, and it was thrashing around and obviously quite distressed. And for when you deal with wildlife, you may know that you, if you want to calm them, then you just cover their eyes. So often you have a towel or a blanket or something that covers their eyes, and then they settle. So I inched towards this deer and managed to grab hold of the end of the goalpost net and then gradually pulled it in and trapped it down a little bit so we could get to it. And I just gently slipped a sheet over its eyes. And so I called to my husband, who was behind me. I called over my shoulder, "Great, come and sit on him." And there was a silence. And I looked over my shoulder, and there was my husband with his chainsaw helmet on and his gardening gloves. And he said, "You must be joking." So anyway, he did help me, and we released the deer. And so this is the poem that came out of it. And my husband says that his poem would be very different to this one. So it's called Trapped. A path leads me to a tangle of buckled poles, and a roe deer trawled in, trying to flip his fate. Kicking and twisting against a snare of cords, churning the grass around him in fury. I cling to the loose lines like a kite in a gale, and exhausted he stops, mouth gaping, bubbles of saliva around his blue slug tongue, each sucked breath ending in a grunt. His fisheye dilated looks through mine. The sheet I slip over his head stills the trembling to tautness. All muscles, elastic, stretched to the point of anticipation. I sever each straining cord. They whip away, cut after cut. And the only things in our world are the cords and the knife and our breath, held somewhere high up in our throats. Thank you.
Thank you, Ilse. I think Amy is back with us. So Amy, would you like to close with anything?
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah, for standing in there for me. The Zoom gremlins got me. But I'm glad I came back at the end, that I just in time to fall into the spell of those last few poems. So thank you so much, Ilse, for your beautiful reading. And thank you everyone for coming along and listening to these beautiful readings. It's a privilege and a pleasure for us to present these poems. Thank you so much, Ilse Pedler. Thank you so much, Sarah Johnson. Thank you so much to everyone who came along. And this is the book, and the links are in the chat. See you again sometime soon.